my generation learned right from wrong, good from evil, the ethical and moral thing to do from comic books.
The origin of Batman starts with alienation and acceptance themes. It's the idea of a kid being orphaned by crime.
It's operatic, it's huge. It's, somebody on their knees crying over their dead parents.
He's spent a good portion of his life honing himself to physical, psychological perfection.
I like Batman for a couple of reasons. First obvious one is that he's got a cape. Capes are really fun to draw. They look really cool. Mostly I like him because he's really angry.
The fact that you can mention Joker and Riddler and Two-Face and Penguin and Catwoman in such a steady stream, they're all characters that can almost exist unto themselves.
You can show people that the icon of the bat symbol in any country, in any language, and they'll look at it and they'll tell you it's Batman.
The thing I love most about working in comics is that it's a legacy. Everybody's really lucky to be a part of that character.
Rising from the depths of tragedy, he has sworn to fight the forces of evil. He is the Batman, one of the most popular and iconic figures in literary history. But the journey that the Dark Knight detective has taken to become a worldwide phenomenon is filled with almost as many twists, turns, and close calls as one of his cases. The story starts in the 1930s. As the United States was facing the ever-growing threat of war, people were looking for a way to escape their everyday troubles. The young, rapidly growing comic book industry supplied the escapism they craved.
There are really only 4 or 5 Native American art forms. The banjo is one, musical comedy as we know it today, the mystery story as started by Edgar Allan Poe, the comic book, which we started, and jazz. Those are the 5. It is a native art form that appeals to our sense and understanding of mixed media. Comic book is the perfect art form. It's got everything but ballet in it.
The comics as we know them in America, really, in a sense, sort of evolved out of, the great comic strips, the newspapers. That was like what you wanted. If you were a comic artist, you wanted to work on newspapers. The comic book themselves sort of came out of the idea of taking newspaper comic strips and essentially putting them in a cover, stapling them together and selling them. The superhero comics were coming in with the war. And so I think these fantasy images are projections of, how do you deal in these tumultuous times? So by the time, America gets involved in the war in 1941 after December 7th when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, then America's finally committed and they're in, and the comic book world is committed too.
DC Comics had quite a success with the mighty Superman, and they found themselves looking for more colorful characters to fill their pages. But was this new kind of superhero just a flash in the pan? The answer was locked in the imagination of a young man named Robert Kane.
Bob Kane was a kid when he created Batman. He was really just a teenager. And it was the late 1930s. The comic book industry was brand new, but he had an interesting assignment. DC Comics was looking for a complement to the first superhero that they had presented, which was Superman. And to Bob, what made the most sense would be to go in the opposite direction and create a character who could be a superhero, but really based in humanity.
I saw a book by Leonardo da Vinci, and he had all his early inventions in the book. There was one drawing of a man on a bat sled. He had huge bat wings, and he was on a sled. It was the first glider into space. And to me, it looked like a bat. And actually, he had a quote, "Your model shall have no other wings but that of a bat." And then basically I saw Zorro, the dual identity of Zorro, with Doug Fairbanks Sr., who was my idol as a kid. At night he fought the desperados in the old Spanish West as Zorro with the mask. And he came out of a cave with a dark horse, a black horse called Tornado, and said I reinterpreted and made a Batmobile.
As far as the other influences, a lot of them came from previous pop culture things that Kane absorbed when he was a kid. The Shadow was a very popular radio character who was mysterious and wore dark clothes and was a creature of the night and fought crime.
Batman is closer to the pulp magazine roots than most characters that were in comics. I mean, I think a lot of the comic book archetypes came out of the pulp magazines. Some of them were really violent and really scary, and I think Batman really kept one foot in that world.
I thought the name was good. It's a good name, Batman. When I saw the drawings of him, he looked like a very mysterious figure with that cape or whatever it was wrapped around him.
Bob Kane, Bruce Wayne, Batman are really all one and the same, and the character is really simply an extension of Bob Kane and who Bob Kane was and what he was about and so forth. He said as a child his dream was to live in a castle in Italy and have a butler. And where does Bruce Wayne live? He lives in a mansion which is close to a castle, and he has Alfred. So I think a lot of his daydreams and things as a child were just incorporated into the character.
I'm really sorry he isn't around today, because he always used to say, "Hey, you see Batman? It was the biggest movie of the year. Where's Spider-Man?" You know, there's nothing I could say. Finally, Spider-Man gets on the screen, and where's Bob? Terrible.
Kane quickly realized that he had a success on his hands, and keeping up with the demand for the Dark Knight's adventures would be more than just a one-man job. Soon he hired a handful of collaborators to help bring the Caped Crusader to life. Men such as Bill Finger, Jerry Robinson, Dick Sprang, and Gardner Fox would in the coming years help the growing legend of the Batman reach heights that even the optimistic Bob Kane couldn't have thought possible.
Batman has always had some of the greatest writers, artists, and editors working on his adventures at DC Comics, really from its inception. Bill Finger was one of the comic book kingdom's great writers. This was a guy who had a fertile imagination, who wasn't afraid to go out and do research to bring interesting tidbits to his stories.
Arguably, Bill understood how to write comics better than anyone back then. It was a brand new medium. Comic books up until Superman had been reprints of comic strips.
Gardner Fox was another important Batman writer, not only of that era, but he was still writing Batman adventures well into the 60s.
Questions of creativity don't come into it. When you're doing a character like that, it belongs to who it belongs to, and the people who help make it only add to the luster.
As the world of Batman was growing and evolving, many of these early adventures laid the foundation for a character who would last for decades upon decades. This Batman was truly a dark avenger who was fearless and sometimes ruthless. He was a playboy by day and a detective by night, fighting to help right the wrongs in what would become Gotham City.
The kid has his parents taken away from him by crime, and then he vows vengeance on the guys who did this. And then he disappears. And we know that he's been training for 10 some odd years, perfecting his mind, perfecting his body. And then he shows up back in Gotham City, ready to carry out his mission. And that mission, he appears as Batman. And we don't get much filled in between the time his parents were shot and he emerges in the Batsuit. That was the way it was in 1939 in the original origin of Batman.
I like the fact that he implies a world that needs a hero, where so many of these characters just seem like these reassuring, glowing figures. Batman's the guy Batman's the guy that you want to have, at your back in a dark alley. Doesn't mean you have to have dinner with him.
As the Batman continued to wreak havoc on the criminal underworld, it quickly became apparent that petty crooks and low-level thugs were no match for this dark avenger of the night. Soon, Batman was defending the good citizens of Gotham from a wide array of colorful but dangerous villains, many of which became classic characters in their own right. Bob Kane had tapped into something big, and now the creative well was overflowing.
In the first issue of Batman Comics, spring 1940, two characters were introduced, the Joker and the Catwoman. And it's really a seminal issue. And you talk about a great first issue comic, that's it.
The Joker, I would submit, is the best trickster character ever. And a perfect villain for Batman, who for all the fact that he lurks in a costume represents the triumph of rationality.
I mean, hands down, my favorite villain has to be the Joker. Like, he's the dude that something bad happened to him, and he's like, well, the way I deal with my grief is by making sure that everyone experiences grief so that he fits in a bit more. So, great. It's a great yin to the yang of Batman. It's been a really great creation.
I always felt that if the Joker as a character was bisected, and one part of him was the vicious killer, and one part was the over-the-top comedian, you would have Two-Face on the one hand and the Riddler on the other.
Any character, any villain exploits a hero's weakness is great. Any character that helps accentuate, makes the character powerful is also great. The fact that the Riddler is out there with these in-depth questions that's always being asked that Batman has to figure out in order to solve the crime, that shows the detective side of Batman, the thinking side of Batman. It's not just about brute force or all the fancy gadgets.
The cool cigarette pack had a penguin on it, and at that time I smoked, and when I was trying to create some supervillains, I said, oh my gosh, this looks like a little fat man in a tuxedo, and why not call him a penguin? We'll make him a villain. It was just simple as that, the cool cigarette thing and penguin.
The entire Rogues Gallery is always interestingly parallel to him because they're not much different than Batman. The only difference is Batman does the right thing, and these dudes are just all about doing the wrong thing, but they all have tragic backstories. Nobody ever just goes like, I'm going to become a criminal. You know, something bad happens to them that spins them off into this direction, just as something bad happened to Bruce Wayne to spin him off into the direction of Batman.
As it was with his enemies, Batman's supporting cast of allies quickly became a big part of his rapidly growing legend. For a character who began as a lone figure in the night, Batman found himself with friends and, perhaps more importantly, his own sense of family.
Even compared to Superman, Batman has a much broader sense of family, I guess, because you have Batman, you have Robin, you have Catwoman, you've got Nightwing. If you want to leak over, you got Justice League of America, Batman's in that, Teen Titans, Robin's in that.
In the comic books, Robin was a seminal character because he was really the first kid sidekick. And pretty soon, almost everyone was getting a kid sidekick.
I think when Bruce looks at Robin, he sees a young man of tremendous potential who can do much to help the common good. But I think also he sees somebody who could be, not left to his own devices, who could be a potential threat and somebody he might have to face, as an adversary someday. So isn't it better that I take this young man and guide him and teach him how to marshal and hone his great skills and use him as a force for good, rather than leave an angry, bitter young man, of great physical power out there on the streets on his own.
When I first got to tell the story of Robin, I wanted a situation and where he would see in this child an opportunity to make the things right that were wrong in his own life.
The character of Jim Gordon is crucial, essential to the Batman mythos. He's one of Batman/Bruce Wayne's only friends.
Commissioner Gordon, or Captain Gordon, I liked him being a captain, so he was up against the bad guys as much as Batman. And Robin and Alfred all have their antecedents. The main thing that is surprising in a way is that Batman's never really there's never really been a mature woman who matches him and is part of his team. Catwoman seems to fall neatly into that, but it never quite works out that way in the comics or the movies.
I know, just as a technical thing, when you're writing a character like Batman, it's kind of good to have somebody to talk to, just to get information out. Well, we're going to do this, rather than just doing it. Alfred just takes care of all that stuff.
Originally, in the comic books, he was Alfred Beagle, a heavy-set gentleman from England who all he wanted to do was be an amateur detective. Eventually, he lost a lot of weight and turned into Alfred Pennyworth, the trusted butler that we all have come to know and love.
Since Batman is in the cave brooding on his dead parents, and he needs somebody to pay the electric bills. I mean, just a guy to run things. He has no idea how the phone bill's getting paid. Alfred just takes care of all that stuff.
The Joker and Catwoman and Robin. I mean, that so much of that still exists today. And being someone who has created new characters and has looked through what's stuck in the last even 20 years, and there's so little that has, there really isn't a whole lot more that certainly has had the kind of impact that those characters did, that you think that those characters could be still here 10 years from now.